The foreclosure notice was still on the kitchen island when the power went out. I was 13. The frozen turkey on the counter, the dark refrigerator, the breath turning white in front of my face, none of it felt like an emergency. It felt like an answer. My parents were in Aspen. They had left me a turkey I couldn't cook, a house I couldn't heat, and a notice that told me everything I needed to know about where I stood. I didn't cry. I calculated. That was when the headlights swept across the kitchen window. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from right now. I'd love to know who's here with me tonight. My uncle Silas Thorne stepped out of a black SUV, read the notice on the door, and looked at me. He didn't say it was love. He handed me a drafting pen and told me to build something no one could take from me. 15 years passed. Silas died, and then my parents came back. They walked into the attorney's office expecting an inheritance. I watched my father Marcus glance at his phone while the lawyer opened the file, still working angles, even in a room like that. Then the attorney began to read. In exchange for a debt settlement of $1.2 million, Marcus and Catherine Reed relinquished all legal parental rights. The air went out of the room. My mother Catherine froze, her hand rising slowly to cover her mouth. Marcus leaned forward. Same jaw, same calculating eyes. That document is ancient history. Silas pressured us into it. Same angles. Even now, my father was still running a deal. I reached into my folder and placed it on the table between them. Your handwriting disagrees. I kept my voice level. So does the date. 3 days before you left me without power. Without heat. Without a reason. He had no answer. You didn't come back for me. I looked at them both. I was a transaction you'd already spent. Silence settled over the room like concrete. They still had no idea what I had been building while they were gone. Before we go any further, please hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. If you give this a like, good luck is coming your way. The rain came down hard that December, the kind of rain that didn't fall so much as press steady and relentless, like a hand flat against your chest, pushing. On the west side of Seattle, where the old money neighborhoods climbed the hills in quiet rows of brick and iron gate. The sound of it against glass was almost musical. Almost, if you were the sort of person who could afford to find it beautiful. Maya Sterling was not, at 13, the sort of person who could afford much of anything. She sat on the bottom step of the central staircase, wrapped in a wool blanket that had started the evening smelling of cedar and now smelled only of cold. The foyer of the house stretched out around her 16-foot ceilings. A chandelier that had gone dark 2 hours ago when the power cut, hardwood floors that cost more per square foot than most people's monthly rent. It was the kind of house that existed to make a statement. That evening, the statement it made was one Maya was only beginning to understand. The mortgage default notice was still on the kitchen island where she'd found it that afternoon. Face up, not even turned over, as though whoever left it hadn't thought to hide it or hadn't thought of her at all. The paper was cream-colored, formal, printed in the particular font that official documents use when they want to sound inevitable. She had read it 3 times. She understood the words. She was 13, not 6. She understood that final notice of default meant that something was ending, and that the thing ending was the ground beneath her feet. Outside, the wind picked up, driving the rain sideways against the tall windows of the sitting room. Maya could see it from where she sat, the rivulets running down the glass. The black shapes of the trees beyond the property wall bending and straightening, bending again, as though agreeing with something unpleasant. Her parents had left for Aspen 2 days before Christmas. Her father, Marcus, had been on a call when the car came, gesturing at the driver to load the bags while he paced the driveway, voice low and tight, the way it got when he was working a deal that was not going well. Or a deal that was going very well with Marcus Reed. It was sometimes hard to tell the difference. Her mother, Catherine, had appeared in the doorway in a camel-colored coat that Maya had not seen before, luggage already staged on the porch in architectural rows. As though the act of leaving required its own design. There's food in the fridge, Catherine had said, pulling on driving gloves. Turkey. The good one. Maya had watched from the upstairs window as the car backed down the long drive, turned into the street, and disappeared into the gray Seattle afternoon. She had stood there for a while after, looking at the place where the car had been, the way you look at a space after something has been removed from it. Measuring what remains, calculating the dimensions of the absence. She found the turkey that evening, after the power went. It sat in the center of the bottom shelf of the refrigerator, enormous and still frozen, solid as a stone. The refrigerator, of course, was no longer cold, just dark, its mechanical hum gone silent, but the turkey radiated its own chill. The kind that had been locked inside it for days and wasn't going anywhere soon. Maya stood with the door open for a long moment, looking at it by the thin beam of the flashlight. She'd found in the utility drawer, and something settled over her that was not quite sadness and not quite anger. Something more still than either of those things. She did not cry. She had learned early that crying was a cost she could rarely afford. Tears required someone to receive them, and the house was empty of anyone who would. Instead, she thought. She sat back down on the stairs with the blanket and the flashlight and she worked through what she knew. The power was off. The house was, apparently, in default. Her parents were in Colorado. The notice on the island was dated 3 weeks ago, which meant this was not a surprise to the adults in her life, only to her. And the frozen turkey in the dark refrigerator was, in some way she was only beginning to articulate, a kind of answer. You couldn't warm a house with frozen meat. You couldn't negotiate with a foreclosure notice. You couldn't run on a promise that had never been kept. She was trying to decide whether she should call someone, a neighbor, a teacher, anyone, when the headlights swept across the front windows. She heard the engine before she saw the vehicle, a low, controlled rumble. The kind that came from something built to be reliable rather than impressive, though it managed to be both. The black SUV pulled up to the curb and sat for a moment, engine running, as though the driver was reading the house first. Reading the final notice, taped to the front door by the utility company, the darkness behind every window. The absence of any sign of the life that was supposed to be happening inside. The door opened. A man got out. He was tall, with the kind of frame that had once been imposing and had settled, with age, into something that was simply authoritative. He wore a dark coat, no hat despite the rain. And he moved up the front walk without hurrying, as though the weather was a matter he had long since ceased to negotiate with. He stopped at the front door, read the notice once, then turned and looked directly at Maya through the sidelight window. As though he had known she was there all along. She opened the door before he knocked. Silas Thorne looked down at her, the blanket around her shoulders, the flashlight in her hand, the completely dry eyes, and something moved across his face that was not quite pity and not quite recognition. Something more complicated. He looked back at the notice on the door, then at her again. They didn't pay the bill, Maya. His voice was low and flat, the kind of voice that had given a great many pieces of bad news and had learned not to dress them up. They traded the wattage for a ski pass. She looked at him for a long moment. The rain fell between them, drumming on the porch roof, pooling in the low places of the front walk. I know, she said. He studied her face. Whatever he was looking for, he seemed to find it, or not find it, and that was answer enough. He looked past her into the dark house, at the cold foyer and the unlit chandelier. And the particular quality of silence that a house acquires when everyone who was supposed to be in it has left. Get your coat, he said. She went back inside. She moved through the dark kitchen by flashlight, past the island with its official paper, past the refrigerator that was no longer humming, into the utility room, where her winter coat hung on a hook near the back door. She put it on. She took nothing else. There was nothing else she particularly wanted, and something told her, with the precise instinct that children develop when they have been learning, quietly, and without help, to read a room that whatever came next was going to require her to travel light. She pulled the front door closed behind her and stood beside Silas Thorne on the porch while he looked at the foreclosure notice one last time. He pulled it from the door, folded it once, twice, and placed it inside his coat pocket. Come on, he said. She walked beside him down the front path, through the rain, toward the idling SUV. The house loomed behind her, dark and enormous and quiet. She did not look back. She had already done the arithmetic, standing in front of that dark refrigerator with the flashlight in her hand, staring at the frozen turkey on its shelf. She had added up what was in front of her and subtracted what was not: the warmth, the power, the parents, the plan, and what remained, once you cleared away everything that had only ever been performance, was a number she now understood. Her existence, in the accounting of the people who were supposed to love her most, had become a liability they could no longer carry. The SUV pulled away from the curb, its headlights cutting pale tunnels through the December rain. Behind them, the house went dark against the hillside. And the darkness was the only thing left in it that hadn't, at some point, been assigned a price. The house Silas Thorne called home was nothing like the one Maya had left behind. Where the Reed house had been built to signal all curved staircases and ornamental ironwork. The architectural equivalent of a cleared throat, the Thorne residence was built to endure. Brutalist in the truest sense: raw concrete, exposed structural elements, windows that were precisely as large as they needed to be and not 1 inch more. It sat on a hillside above the water, anchored to the rock like something that had grown there rather than been built. And when the wind came off Puget Sound in winter, the walls absorbed it without comment. The house did not perform. It simply stood. Maya arrived there on a Thursday night in December with the clothes on her back and the flashlight still in her coat pocket, and Silas showed her to a room on the second floor that had a narrow bed, a drafting table, a lamp, and a window that looked out over the water. He did not offer a tour. He did not tell her how long she would be staying. He set a key on the drafting table, told her breakfast was at 7, and left. She stood alone in the room for a long time after he closed the door, looking at the lamp, the table, the window and the dark water beyond it. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her palms flat against her thighs and breathed until the tightness in her chest settled into something manageable. At 7 the next morning she came downstairs to find Silas at the kitchen table with coffee and a stack of papers, already reading. He did not look up when she entered, but he nodded toward a chair, and she sat, and a woman named Mrs. Garfield, who came 3 mornings a week, put a plate of eggs in front of her without being asked. Maya ate. Silas read. Outside, the rain had stopped and the sound was gray and flat and enormous. It was several minutes before he spoke. You know what a 401k is? She considered. Retirement savings. Pre-tax contributions. He looked up then, for the first time, with an expression she would come to recognize, not quite surprise, not quite approval. Something more reserved than either. He reached into the stack of papers and slid a document across the table toward her. It was a retirement account statement, dense with numbers, rows of figures that represented values and positions and percentage changes over time. Tell me what you see, he said. She studied it for a long moment. The allocation is too conservative for someone this age, she said. Unless they're expecting a major drawdown. He looked at her steadily. I read, she said simply. He pulled the statement back. Good, he said. And that, for Silas Thorne, was the beginning of an education. In the weeks that followed, she learned that the house operated on a set of principles that were different from any she had known. There was no warmth offered freely, no casual affection, no reassurances, no language of comfort. But there was structure. There were expectations that were clearly stated and consistently kept. There was, she came to understand, a kind of honesty in the house that the Reed house had never contained. The honesty of a place that did not pretend to be something it wasn't. One afternoon, nearly 3 weeks after her arrival, Silas set a drafting pen on the table in front of her. Design something, he said. She looked at the pen. What? A shelter. For yourself. Something no one can take from you. He settled back in his chair, arms folded. Make it untouchable, or you'll end up like your father, broken. It was the first time he had mentioned Marcus directly. The word broken landed on the table between them like a stone dropped from a height, and Maya watched it settle without flinching. She picked up the pen. She drew for 2 hours that first afternoon, and then 2 hours the next day, and the day after that. What she produced was rough and impractical and structurally naive in ways she would only understand years later. But it was hers, designed from the inside out, every wall placed where she needed it, every opening positioned to let in exactly as much as she wanted and no more. When she showed it to Silas, he looked at it for a long time without speaking. The load-bearing walls are wrong, he said finally. I know. I'll fix them. He handed it back. Yes, he said. You will. It was one evening in February, when the cold had eased slightly and a thin pale light was coming off the water at dusk, that she found the Medicare card. She had gone into Silas's study to return a book she had borrowed, an anthology of structural engineering principles. She had worked through twice already, and she set it on the corner of his desk and was turning to leave when she saw it. It was sitting face up among a small stack of medical documents, the pale blue card with its white lettering, its numbers, its small printed name. Silas Aaron Thorne. She stood very still. She understood, in a way that a 13-year-old perhaps should not have understood, what it meant to find Medicare paperwork in a man's desk. It meant doctors. It meant a system that was preparing for a cost. It meant that the great, concrete, unyielding structure of Silas Thorne was, somewhere beneath the surface, crumbling. She replaced the book on the shelf, not the desk. The shelf, as though she had never set it down, and walked back out of the study and pulled the door quietly closed behind her. She did not mention it. Neither did he. That night, she tried Catherine's number for the first time since arriving. She had memorized it years ago, the way you memorize something you expect to need in an emergency, which was, she supposed, exactly what this was. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed with the phone in her hand and dialed. The line rang twice, then produced a recording. The number she had reached was no longer in service. She held the phone for a moment after the recording finished. Then she set it on the drafting table, face down, and picked up the drafting pen and went back to fixing the load-bearing walls. There are moments that do not announce themselves as turning points when they arrive. They look like ordinary evenings: a disconnected phone number, a Medicare card on a desk. A girl in a borrowed room fixing the structural flaws in a design she has made for herself. It is only later, looking back from a distance, that you can see them for what they were: the moments the concrete sets. The moments the foundation is poured. The moments you stop being a child who is waiting to be claimed and start being something else entirely. One evening, not long after, Silas came to the doorway of her room and stood there watching her work at the drafting table. The lamp making a small warm circle on the paper, everything beyond it in shadow. Am I your niece, she said, without looking up, or your property? The silence lasted long enough that she finally turned to look at him. He was leaning against the doorframe, arms folded, watching her with that unreadable expression, the one that was not quite anything, that refused to be named. "You're the only investment," he said, "that I haven't written off yet." She held his gaze. Then she turned back to the paper. It was not love, what he offered. She knew that. She had never been confused about it. But it was something, some category of regard that did not require her to perform or diminish or disappear. And in the accounting of her life, which she had been running in her head since the night of the dark refrigerator, and the frozen turkey and the rain against the glass, it was more than she had been given before. Concrete, she was learning, doesn't need to love you to keep you safe. 15 years is a long time to become someone. It is long enough to earn a degree, and then another, and then to work in someone else's firm for 3 years before walking out and starting your own. Long enough to design buildings that win awards, to build a reputation that precedes you into every room, to develop the particular kind of self-possession that comes not from having been given things but from having built them from scratch. Wall by wall, with your own materials, on ground you selected and cleared yourself. Long enough to become, at 28, the kind of woman who makes other people feel that they should have prepared more before the meeting. It was also long enough to watch Silas Thorne decline. Slowly at first, and then with the grim momentum that serious illness develops once it has decided to be honest with you. He had managed it with the same austere competence he applied to everything: the right doctors, the right treatments, the information organized and filed and tracked with the precision of a man who believed that chaos was a form of moral failure. He had not asked for help he didn't need. He had not dramatized. And when, in late autumn of the year Maya turned 28, his heart finally stopped in the early morning hours, while the sound outside was still dark and quiet, it was without fuss or ceremony, as though he had scheduled the departure for a time that would cause the minimum inconvenience to the household. The silence that followed was expensive, in every sense. Maya had been at the house, she had kept a room there for 15 years. A habit that had never been formalized and never been questioned, and it was she who called the necessary people, who dealt with the necessary paperwork, who made the arrangements with the compressed efficiency that Silas had always required of her and that she had internalized so completely it no longer felt like discipline. It simply felt like how things were done. She gave herself 3 days. On the 4th day, they arrived. She heard them before she saw them: the sound of car doors, more than one, the low crunch of expensive tires on the gravel drive. She was in the study when they pulled up, reviewing the estate documents she had organized on the desk. And she moved to the window and looked down at the drive below. 2 cars, black, both of them rented, she noted, from the way they sat too low and the door handles were wrong for the model. A man in a dark coat getting out of the first one, straightening his tie, looking up at the facade of the house with an expression that was performing grief but was actually measuring. A woman from the second car, in a black dress and a veil that was perhaps 1/4 inch too theatrical for sincerity, moving toward the front door with the particular gait of someone who has already decided this place belongs to them and is only waiting for the paperwork to confirm it. Marcus Reed, Catherine Reed, her parents, in the loosest and most technical sense of the word. She watched Marcus check his phone before he'd even reached the door, which told her what she needed to know. She watched Catherine pause at the base of the front steps and look up at the house, with something she might have described, to someone who didn't know her, as emotion. Maya knew her better than that. She was already at the top of the stairs when Mrs. Garfield let them in, and she came down slowly, one hand on the rail, and watched them look up at her. Marcus with his practiced, mournful expression and his eyes that were already cataloging the furnishings, Catherine with a handkerchief she had not needed until Maya appeared and now pressed briefly to her mouth. Maya. Catherine stepped forward, arms opening, the gesture of embrace that requires nothing so specific as actual contact. "Oh, sweetheart." Maya stopped on the bottom step. "Hello, Catherine." A small pause, a recalibration. Catherine lowered her arms with the smooth recovery of a woman who had been managing social situations for decades. "We came as soon as we could," she said. The flight from Seattle to Aspen is an hour and a half," Maya said. "The flight back is the same. You've been in Aspen for the past 4 days. Marcus stepped forward then, and his face shifted into the particular arrangement that Maya associated with his damage control mode forehead slightly lowered, expression softer, voice dropping into the register he used when he was about to say something he needed you to believe. "Maya, I know this is hard." Silas was. He was 79 years old with end-stage heart disease. His death was not a surprise to anyone who had been present for the last 18 months of his life. She looked at him evenly. He was also meticulous about his arrangements. "So I suggest we focus on those." She led them into the sitting room. She sat across from them. She watched Marcus's eyes move to the painting above the fireplace. which she knew he recognized because she had heard Silas tell him, at an uncomfortable Thanksgiving dinner 12 years ago, that it was worth more than Marcus's entire investment portfolio. She watched Catherine's gaze travel to the credenza in the study doorway, where Silas had kept, in open view, a leather-bound ledger embossed with his initials. They drank tea. They made the appropriate sounds. Marcus talked about what a remarkable man Silas had been, which was true in a way that Marcus didn't mean and therefore didn't understand. Catherine asked, with the studied casualness of a woman who had been rehearsing the question, whether Maya had been involved in managing things toward the end. Estate things, she clarified, financial things, just asking. Maya said that she had been involved in exactly the ways Silas had designated. That evening, she was in the study reviewing a document when she heard Catherine behind her. She turned to find her mother standing at the bookcase beside the credenza, one hand on the spine of the leather ledger, beginning to pull it from the shelf. Maya crossed the room in 4 steps. Her hand closed over Catherine's wrist with a grip that did not hurt but did not negotiate. Catherine looked at her. Something moved in her expression, surprise, or perhaps the recognition that the child she had left in a dark house 15 years ago had become, in her absence, someone else entirely. The security code changed the minute his heart stopped. Catherine, Maya said quietly. Every system in this house. Every safe, every file, every account. I was his executor. I was his attorney, in fact. I have been, for the last 4 years, the person who handled every document in this building. She released Catherine's wrist. She set the ledger back on the shelf. If you want something from this house, she said, you'll ask me for it. She watched her mother's face, the calculation running behind the careful expression, the adjustment. The reframing, and she thought about the phone call she had tried to make at 13, the number that was no longer in service, the girl sitting on the edge of a narrow bed with a deadline in her hand. She thought about what it had cost her to stop expecting anyone to answer. Marcus's smile, when she returned to the sitting room, was the smile of a man who had not yet understood that he had already lost. It was the smile of someone who still thought this was a negotiation he could work. She recognized it. She had been watching it her whole life. And she knew, better than most, that the most dangerous person in any negotiation is the one who has already decided what they're willing to lose because they know, within architect's precision, exactly what will remain standing when everything else comes down. The reading of the will took place on a Tuesday morning at the offices of Hargrove, Bell & Associates. A firm that occupied the top 3 floors of a granite building in downtown Seattle, the kind of building that had been designed to communicate permanence to everyone who entered it. The waiting area smelled of leather and old paper. The receptionist spoke in a register calibrated for grief and legal sobriety. Rain moved against the tall windows in long, diagonal lines. Maya arrived 12 minutes early. She wore gray, a structured blazer, high-collared, the kind of garment that allowed no softness at the collar or cuff. She sat in the waiting area and did not take out her phone and did not look at the door. Marcus and Catherine arrived 7 minutes late. Marcus had his iPad with him, which he tucked under his arm when he saw her, but not before she had noticed his thumb moving on the screen, the quick, habitual gesture of a man reviewing something. Catherine wore more black than the occasion strictly required. They sat across from Maya and Marcus crossed his ankle over his knee and looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man who considers waiting beneath him. Thank you all for coming, said the attorney, a man named Ellsworth with the measured energy of someone who had presided over a great many difficult rooms. He opened a folder. He adjusted his reading glasses. He looked at each of them in turn. I'll read the principal provisions in full, as Mr. Thorne's instructions specified. There was the initial language, the boilerplate, the formal declarations of testamentary capacity and intent. The specific bequests of minor items to named individuals at the firm in the household. Mrs. Garfield received a generous sum. A former business associate received the vintage car Silas had kept in storage and never driven. These things were received without incident. Then Ellsworth reached the major provisions, and the room changed. He read the language of the severance clause twice. Once in the technical legal phrasing of the document itself, and once, at Maya's request, in plain English. What it said, stripped of its clauses and subclauses, was this: 15 years ago, in exchange for the full settlement of a debt amounting to $1.2 million, Marcus and Catherine Reed had executed a legal agreement by which they relinquished all parental rights to Maya Thorne. She was named by this document as Maya Thorne, not Maya Reed, and formally severed her status as a member of the Reed family in any legal capacity. The agreement had been notarized. It had been witnessed. It had been filed. It had been, in other words, done properly. The way Marcus Reed did everything that was ultimately about money. Ellsworth set the document down. The original is dated approximately 15 years ago, he said. It was prepared in conjunction with a debt settlement initiated by Mr. Silas Thorne on behalf of the debtor, Marcus Reed. The settlement covered the full outstanding balance on what appears to have been a residential mortgage. He paused, not for drama, simply for air. The property associated with the mortgage was subsequently lost to foreclosure. The room held that. Maya looked at the document on the table in front of her. It was a photocopy, but the original sat beside it in a clear sleeve, and she could see through the plastic the texture of paper that was 15 years old. The ink that had dried on her parents' signatures while she was sitting in a dark house with a frozen turkey and a flashlight, trying to calculate what remained. $1.2 million. The price of the house they couldn't keep. The house they hadn't even managed to save. She had been sold to cover the cost of a home they subsequently lost anyway. And the arithmetic of that, the particular, terrible precision of it settled over her now like a weight that had finally found its proper place. Marcus had not moved. She looked at him. He was looking at the table, at some point slightly to the left of the document. And his face had undergone a rearrangement that she had never seen before, not the managed expressions of negotiation or performance, but something rawer and less controlled, the face of a man confronted with a number he had thought was settled. The remaining provisions of Mr. Thorne's estate, Ellsworth continued, including all real property, financial holdings, investment accounts, and operating interests, are bequeathed in their entirety to his sole heir. He looked up over his glasses. Miss Maya Thorne. The estate, as the attorney explained in the pages that followed, amounted to a figure with 9 digits. The properties alone included the Hillside House, 2 commercial buildings in downtown Seattle, and a waterfront parcel on the Sound that had appreciated considerably since its acquisition. The investment portfolio, managed conservatively and with exceptional foresight, had compounded steadily for decades. There were trusts, structured instruments, and a private foundation that Silas had established quietly and never publicized, funded at a level that would ensure its operation in perpetuity. Catherine made a sound. It was small and involuntary, and she suppressed it immediately, but it had already happened. And Maya heard it clearly, the sharp intake of a woman understanding, for the first time in a single moment, exactly how much she had signed away. Exactly what she had traded, 15 years ago, for a debt settlement on a house that was gone now and had never really been hers anyway. Marcus cleared his throat. He uncrossed his legs. He straightened in his chair. "I think," he said, in the controlled, careful voice of a man attempting a comeback on a board he no longer controlled, "that we should discuss what Silas would have wanted for the family as a whole." He looked at Maya. "Regardless of whatever the legal documents." "The legal documents," Maya said, "are the conversation." He stopped. "You signed the severance clause, Marcus." Her voice was level. It did not rise. It did not need to. "You and Catherine. 15 years ago. You made a decision about what you valued more. You made a transaction, and the transaction was completed, and everything in this room today is the result of that transaction." She picked up the copy of the document and set it back down without looking at it. "So we don't need to have a conversation about what Silas would have wanted. The document tells us what was decided." Marcus opened his mouth. "I wasn't just a daughter you left behind," she said, and something in her voice changed, not loud, not cracked, but different in some way that she could feel from the inside. Some word finally said that had been sitting behind her back teeth for a long time. "I was a transaction you'd already spent." Nobody spoke. Outside, the rain continued moving against the glass, unconcerned, doing what rain does regardless of what happens in the rooms behind the windows. The chandelier in the conference room cast its regulated warmth over the table, over the documents, over 4 people who had been in a relationship with each other for 28 years. That had always been about the terms and never about the thing the terms were supposed to protect. Ellsworth gathered his papers. Marcus sat very still. For once, he had nothing to reframe. The ink on the document was 15 years old and dry as bone. But the feeling it left in Maya's chest, looking at her parents' signatures beside the notary's stamp, was something else entirely, warm and wet and present. As though the betrayal had just been completed rather than simply confirmed. She collected her copy of the document. She folded it precisely. She placed it in the inside pocket of her blazer, over her heart, not tenderly, simply practically, the way you carry something that belongs to you. She stood. She thanked Ellsworth. She did not look at her parents again. She walked out of the conference room and through the leather and old paper waiting area and into the elevator that opened immediately as though it had been waiting. And she rode it down to the lobby in silence, and she walked out through the granite building's front doors and into the Seattle rain. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment with the rain coming down on her shoulders and the sound of the city around her. Traffic. A horn somewhere, the hiss of tires on wet pavement, and she breathed. She was 28 years old. She was worth more money than her parents had ever managed to accumulate or keep. She had been sold for $1.2 million to cover a mortgage on a house that no longer existed, and the people who had sold her were, at this very moment, sitting in a conference room above her trying to find language adequate to a situation they had created 15 years ago. When they put their signatures on a piece of paper and drove to Aspen. The rain fell. The city moved. She breathed. She had been born in a house of lies. She had been raised in a fortress of stone. And now the stone was hers. Friends, thank you for staying with me through the first half of Maya's story. We've seen her face things that no child should ever have to face, abandoned in a cold house. Sold off like a line item in a ledger, and raised by a man who gave her strength without warmth, tools without tenderness. We've watched her grow from a 13-year-old girl who refused to cry in the dark into a woman who can sit across a table from the people who discarded her and speak with perfect clarity about exactly what they did. And now the full weight of the truth has landed. The severance clause, the signatures, the price that was put on her when she was a child. But we're only halfway through. Because the question now is not what was done to Maya Sterling, it's what Maya Sterling is going to do next. And if you've been paying attention, you already know she has been building towards something. She is, after all, an architect. Stay with me. The most important work is still ahead. Memory is not linear. It does not sit in the mind organized by date and occasion, retrievable on demand in the order it occurred. It moves more like water finding its own level. Pressing through the cracks, surfacing when the conditions are right and the pressure from above becomes too great to hold. The night after the reading, Maya sat in Silas's study, her study now. Though the word did not yet feel natural with a glass of water she was not drinking and the documents from Ellsworth's office spread across the desk. The rain had stopped. The sound was visible through the window, black and flat and wide, the lights of the far shore reflected in long, broken lines across the surface. She was not reading. She was remembering. She remembered the night of the freeze. She remembered it in the way you remember things that have been stored in the body rather than the mind, not as images exactly, but as sensory facts. The cold, the specific texture of the wool blanket, the way the flashlight beam had trembled slightly, and she had realized the trembling was her own hands, and she had made them stop. She remembered something she had not thought about in years. A voice. Her father's voice, low and pressured, the way it got when something was at stake. She had been halfway up the stairs, and Marcus had been in the library with the door almost but not entirely closed, and his voice had come through the gap. With the particular carrying quality of a voice that is trying to be quiet but is too agitated to manage it fully. I'm closing the deal with Silas tonight. The numbers work. The old man wants the girl, and I want the debt cleared. It's simple. She had been 13. She had not understood what she was hearing, not completely, not in the way she understood it now. Sitting in this study with his signature on a document in front of her. She had filed it away the way children file things they don't yet have the framework to process and moved it to a place in herself she rarely visited. She visited it now. She understood it now. Silas had not, in the end, saved her. He had acquired her, foreclosed on her, precisely, the way you foreclose on a property with hidden value that the current owner has failed to develop. He had seen in Marcus's daughter something Marcus had never bothered to look for, and he had purchased that something at a price that satisfied Marcus's immediate needs and settled. Perhaps, an older grievance between two brothers that Maya had never been told about. And had only understood obliquely, the way you understand the history of a building from its foundation rather than its facade. She had been a pawn. She had always known this, in some partial, protected way. But knowing it partially and knowing it completely, holding the document in your hands. Seeing the figure, understanding the transaction in every particular, those were different weights. She sat with it, and then something shifted, because she was an architect and architects do not sit with problems, they look at them. They measure them. They ask what is the load-bearing element here, and what is merely decorative, and where does the structure fail, and how do you build something that doesn't. She had been built by Silas Thorne. She could not undo that. She had been sold by Marcus Reed. She could not undo that either. But the structure that had been made out of all of it, the cold. The darkness, the drafting pen, the years of working until she understood exactly how things were held up and what happened when the support failed, that structure was hers. Genuinely, legally, completely hers. And it was not broken. She looked at the documents on the desk. Marcus had committed fraud. She had not yet confirmed this, not fully, but she had been her father's daughter long enough to know his methods. And she had managed Silas's affairs long enough to know where the edges of them were, and she had noticed, in the past 18 months of handling the estate accounts, certain anomalies. Certain claims, certain names on insurance documents that should not have been there. She picked up a pen. She opened a fresh page. She began, with the precision and patience of someone who has spent 15 years. Learning that good structures do not happen by accident, to write down what she knew. The pawn, it turned out, had been learning the board this whole time. The thing about insurance fraud, Maya had learned in the weeks that followed, is that it leaves a paper trail with the particular stubbornness of something that believes it has been hidden. Every claim filed, every disbursement made, every explanation of benefits document generated by a system that does not know or care whether the identity attached to the account belongs to a living man or a dead one. Silas Thorne had been dead for 7 weeks when Maya first pulled the full EOB record for his insurance accounts and found the anomaly. A claim filed 11 days after his death. A pharmaceutical reimbursement for a medication that Silas's physicians had discontinued 8 months before he died. A billing address that was not the Hillside house and not any address she recognized. She pulled the next month. Another claim. She pulled the month before his death, recalibrating her window, looking for the pattern with the same systematic focus. She brought to a structural analysis, not looking for what she expected to find, but looking at what was actually there. What was actually there was a series of claims, extending back 14 months, that did not correspond to Silas's actual treatment history. Small amounts, individually unremarkable, collectively, across 14 months, a number large enough to matter. She cross-referenced. She pulled the offshore transaction logs she had found in Silas's files accounts. She had not fully analyzed, because they had not initially seemed relevant to the estate administration. They became relevant now. The amounts and the timing aligned with the pattern she was building on the legal pad beside her laptop. Each line of handwriting a new piece of a structure she was beginning to understand the shape of. Marcus Reed had been using Silas's identity. He had been doing it for over a year carefully, incrementally, in amounts calibrated to remain below the thresholds that trigger automatic review. He had built, out of Silas's name and coverage, a supplemental income stream that had been maintaining the lifestyle he could no longer sustain on his own. The rented limos and the Aspen trips and the dark coat that fit like it had cost what it probably had cost. She did not feel satisfaction when she confirmed it. She felt something colder and more precise, the specific clarity of a person who has been building a case and has now found the keystone. She photographed everything. She organized the records chronologically, with annotations, in the way that she imagined a federal prosecutor might want to receive them, which is to say, the way that made the pattern impossible to miss and the connections impossible to argue with. She made copies. She stored them in 3 separate locations, 1 physical and 2 digital, with different access credentials for each. Then she called in a favor. His name was Daniel Cho, and he had been a federal prosecutor for 11 years before moving into private practice, and Maya had designed his firm's offices 4 years ago. A commission she had deliberately underpriced because she had understood, even then, that a relationship with someone of his particular expertise was worth more than the difference. He had known this too, and they had maintained, since then, the kind of professional friendship that is built on mutual respect and a shared understanding that the favor, when it came, would be proportionate. She met him in her slate gray office on a Wednesday morning. She set the documents on the conference table between them. She gave him 20 minutes to review them while she looked out the window at the city below, at the streets and buildings that were, in their aggregate, a record of every decision made about what to build and where and how, every structure a consequence of choices, every skyline a story about what people had decided to value and preserve. Maya, Daniel said, when he had finished. She turned around. This is comprehensive. He was looking at her over the top of the folder. Where did you get the offshore logs? Silas's files. He kept everything. And you've had these for 6 weeks. I wanted to be certain before I brought them to anyone. He looked back at the documents. He turned a page. He turned another. Insurance fraud at this level is a federal matter, he said. The identity theft element complicates it further. If the offshore accounts cross international jurisdictions, they do. Then you're looking at multiple federal charges. He set the folder down. Have you had any contact with your parents since the reading? They've called. I haven't answered. Good. Keep it that way. He picked up the folder again. I'll need to bring this to someone in the U.S. Attorney's office. Someone I trust. This is going to move when it moves. I know. She sat down across from him. I'm not seeking a reconciliation, Daniel. I want to be clear about that. He looked at her. I am seeking a total structural failure, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once, the nod of a man who has understood exactly what is being asked of him and has decided he can provide it. He closed the folder. 2 days later, she sent Marcus and Catherine a letter. It was written on the letterhead of the Thorne estate, in formal and precise language. And it offered the possibility of a private settlement discussion regarding certain financial matters related to the estate that she was prepared to make available. It was, in every technical respect, a legitimate document. It named a time and a place and asked for confirmation of attendance. It was also, in every practical respect, a trap. She sent it on a Thursday. She received Marcus's confirmation by Friday morning. He had not consulted an attorney. She knew this because the confirmation came from his personal email address, without the CC to any legal representative that a man with proper counsel would have included. He was already certain he was winning. She had been counting on that. That evening, she drove to the hillside house. She let herself in with the code only she knew, and she walked through the rooms that were hers now, through the kitchen and the study and the narrow hallway, where the drafting table in her old room still sat against the wall. And she stood at the window of the study and looked out at the sound, at the dark water and the far lights and the long, broken reflections. She thought about Silas. Not with grief, exactly, grief had a specific shape, and what she felt for Silas was more complicated than that, more textured. She thought about what he had given her and what he had taken. And she thought about the fact that both of those things had ultimately made her more capable of what she was about to do. You could be angry at someone and still be grateful for what they built in you. You could refuse to forgive and still use the tools they gave you. The two things were not contradictory. They were, in fact, the architecture of someone who had survived. She had one more thing to prepare. She went into the study and sat at the desk and opened Silas's files again. There was a document she had noticed during the estate review and had set aside, not understanding its relevance at the time, a deed for a small property. A cliffside parcel that Silas had acquired quietly, separate from the main estate, in a transaction that had not been publicized. It was in Maya's name. It had been put there 6 years ago. He had known, she understood now. He had known that Marcus would come. He had known what Marcus would look for. He had made sure that when Marcus came looking, Maya would be ready. The old man had played a longer game than even she had realized. She closed the folder and sat for a moment in the quiet of the study that had once been his, in the house that now was hers, in the city that had watched all of this without comment, the way cities do, indifferent, massive, impervious, exactly like concrete. In the morning, the trap would close. For once, the paperwork was protecting her. It was the kind of morning that Seattle produces in early spring, when the weather hasn't fully decided what it's going to be, the sky a pale, undetermined gray. The water of the Sound lying flat and still, a thin mist sitting at the level of the hills. The air had that particular quality it gets just before the day commits to something, cool and suspended, waiting. Maya was already at the cliffside house when the sun came up, not fully up, but beginning that first thin light that makes the shadows longer before it makes them shorter. She had arrived an hour before dawn. She had unlocked the door of the small cliffside property, the one whose deed carried her name, and she had walked through its rooms, which were nearly empty, only a few items of furniture left from Silas's occupation of the place, and she had made a pot of coffee in the kitchen. And she had stood at the window and watched the dark water lighten, degree by degree, as the sky above it changed. The property deed was in her coat pocket. The full documentation package, the EOB records, the offshore transaction logs, the fraud analysis. Everything organized and annotated was in a case on the kitchen table. Daniel Cho had made one call the previous day, and the people he called had made 2 more. And the result of those calls was currently parked in an unmarked vehicle at the base of the cliff road, waiting for her signal. She had given Marcus and Catherine the address of this property in the settlement letter. She had described it as Silas's most recently acquired holding, which was factually true. She had suggested that the discussion of its disposition, along with related estate matters, would benefit from reviewing certain physical documents on site. She had told them to come at 8 in the morning. She had not told them she would be there. They arrived at 8:12. She heard the car on the gravel, the same kind of rented car, the suspension giving slightly on the uneven surface of the cliff road. She heard the doors. She heard Marcus's voice saying something, too low to make out, and Catherine's response, and then silence while they presumably stood outside and looked at the house. Then she heard something she had not expected, the sound of the lock. Not knocked, not rang, the sound of a key being tried in the lock. The particular scrape and click of it. She stood very still in the kitchen and listened. The lock did not open. It had been changed, along with every other lock she controlled, on the night Silas died. But the attempt told her everything she needed to know. Marcus had come with a key. He had come prepared to enter whether or not he was invited. He had come, in other words, not for a conversation but for a search. She waited until she heard him try the back door, same sound, same failure, and then the sound of a window being tested, cautiously, the frame protesting slightly in the way old window frames do. She called Daniel. Now, she said. She heard him relay the instruction. She heard, a few seconds later, the sound of car doors from below and the crunch of tires on the cliff road. She walked to the front door and unlocked it from the inside and opened it. Marcus was standing at the corner of the house, the failed key still in his hand. He turned when the door opened, and the expression on his face went through several phases in rapid succession: surprise, recovery, calculation, and finally a version of the performance she had always known best. The one that had managed so many situations before: controlled, reasonable, entirely prepared to explain. Maya. He spread his hands slightly, a gesture of openness. We came early, we thought, given the drive. You tried the lock, she said. He stopped. Catherine appeared behind him, coming around the corner from where she had apparently been trying a separate entry point. She stopped when she saw Maya in the doorway. The handkerchief was absent today. Today Catherine's face had been stripped of its performance, and what was underneath was something Maya had rarely seen: not grief, not affection, but something raw and pragmatic, the face of a woman who is calculating odds. "You're trespassers," Maya said. It was not a dramatic statement. It was the plainest, most accurate word for what they were, said in the same level voice she used for everything. And it landed on the still morning air with the weight of a fact. "You've attempted illegal entry into a property that belongs to me. I have both the deed and witnesses." The vehicles from the cliff road pulled up. Daniel got out of one, and 2 federal agents in plain clothes got out of another, and behind them a uniformed officer from the county sheriff's department. The morning mist was still sitting in the low places of the landscape. And the light was still that pale, committed gray, and the sound was flat and wide and silent below. Marcus looked at the agents. He looked at Daniel. He looked at Maya. Maya. His voice had lost the controlled register. Something was coming through it now, something she might have read, once, as distress, but understood now as simply the sound of a man confronted with math that doesn't work. "Whatever you think you know. I have 14 months of insurance claims filed under Silas's identity after his documented diagnoses made those claims impossible," she said. "I have offshore transaction records showing the disbursements received on those claims. I have a forensic accountant's analysis of the alignment between those amounts and dates, and I have a federal prosecutor standing next to me who has already presented this material to the U.S. Attorney's Office." She paused. "And I have the severance clause, which means that whatever you were planning to say about family, or about what's owed, or about what Silas would have wanted, the paperwork has already addressed that." Catherine sat down on the front step. It was not a chosen action, her legs simply arrived at a decision before the rest of her did. Marcus had gone very still. The hand with the key was at his side. "You're not family," Maya said. "The law confirmed that 15 years ago with your own signatures. You're trespassers, and you're defendants." She stepped back from the doorway and let Daniel and the agents move forward. She watched Marcus's face as the agent reached him, the total rearrangement of it, the collapse of every construction that had held it in place for decades. She watched the moment the handcuffs appeared, the way his body absorbed the reality of them, the particular stillness of a man who has run out of reframes. Catherine stood back up and was guided, carefully, by the uniformed officer. She looked at Maya once, across the gravel, with an expression that contained in layers that Maya could read clearly now, after 28 years of study. Something that might have been intended as appeal. As if the right look, found at last, might locate the child who had stood in the dark kitchen with a flashlight and opened something in her. Maya met her eyes. She held them steadily and without anger. She had decided, long ago, that anger was a cost she was no longer prepared to carry on behalf of people who had never paid their own debts. She looked away first, not because she had to, because she chose to. She walked back inside and stood at the kitchen window while the sounds outside organized themselves into departure. The car doors, the engines, the tires on the gravel road. She looked out at the water. The mist was beginning to lift. The sound stretched out below, wide and cold and exact, the morning light starting finally to commit to something pale gold on the water, the far shore becoming distinct. 15 years ago, a court had written in ink what her parents' signatures had already said. Today, a federal proceeding had written in ink what their actions had said for 14 months. And Maya stood in a house that was hers, on a cliff above water. She could see clearly now, holding the knowledge that the system she had learned to read and work and live inside had, this morning, performed the function it was built for. Not for the first time. Not without cost. But finally, and without ambiguity, in her favor. Today the law had written in ink what her heart had been saying in silence for 15 years. And watching the last car disappear down the cliff road was the warmest she had felt since the night of the freeze. The mahogany study was quieter than it had ever been. It had always been a quiet room. Silas had designed it that way, the walls thick, the window glass heavy. The acoustic character of the space calibrated to muffle the world outside to a low murmur. But the quiet it held now was different from the quiet of Silas's occupation. His had been the silence of a man who required stillness in order to think clearly, who imposed order on a room. The way he imposed it on everything else, through will, through structure, through the particular authority of someone who has decided how things will be and made that decision permanent. Hers was something else. She sat in the leather chair behind the desk, his chair, for the first time. She had avoided it until now, not from sentiment exactly, but from some instinct she hadn't fully examined. She sat in it now and felt the weight of it, the specific way it held her. It fit, she noticed. Not because it had been made for her, but because she had been, over a long time and through circumstances that had not been gentle, shaped into someone who fit in rooms like this. Outside, the sound caught the afternoon light and held it. The water was doing that particular thing it does on clear days in late spring. When the sun hits at an angle that makes the surface look like hammered silver, every ripple a different note of the same light. She had looked at that water from this window for 15 years, first as a child making herself useful, then as an adult. Managing an estate, never quite as the person to whom it belonged. She was that person now. She opened her contacts. Mom. The word sat on the screen for a moment, the label she had entered at some point in the past when the concept it described still seemed like something that might, eventually, mean what it was supposed to mean. She pressed delete. The phone asked if she was sure. She confirmed that she was. Dad. The same process. The same confirmation. The reads. This one she moved to trash, which felt more accurate than deletion. Trash is where things go when they have no further use, when you are done carrying them. She set the phone face down on the desk. From the file on the right side of the desk, she took the contract. It was from the city, a commission she had won 3 months ago and had not yet signed, waiting for the right moment. Or perhaps waiting for enough room in her life to attend to what it meant. A community center in the Rainier Valley neighborhood, on a site that had been vacant for years. The design was hers, open, modular, built around a central atrium that let in the northern light at an angle that changed across the day. She had specified, during the design process, that the interior doors would not have locks. Not the ones inside. A building, she had thought, that knows it is for people rather than against them should not lock them in. She signed it, her signature, the one she had been putting on architectural documents since she was 22. Maya Thorne, clean and direct, nothing ornamental. She had always signed it without hesitation, but there had been, until recently, something slightly separate about the name, as though she were signing on behalf of a person she was still becoming. Today it felt different. From the left drawer of the desk, she withdrew the document in its clear sleeve. The severance clause. The original, the one that Ellsworth had given her at the reading, the 15-year-old paper with its formal language and its notary's stamp and the 2 signatures at the bottom that had turned a child into a financial instrument and then forgotten the transaction entirely until the transaction walked back in. With the estate documents and the federal evidence and a face that had learned, over a long time and in difficult conditions, not to ask permission. She held it up to the light for a moment. The paper was yellowed at the edges, slightly thickened in the way that documents from archival cases sometimes are. The signatures were clear. The notary's stamp was still sharp. She had considered, at various points over the past weeks, what to do with this document. She had considered destroying it, the straightforward satisfaction of watching it go. She had considered filing it, keeping it purely for legal purposes, treating it as nothing more than what it literally was. But neither of those felt right, and she had learned to pay attention to what felt right. Because she had built her entire professional life on the principle that the intuition driving a design is often more accurate than the analysis that follows it. She opened the top right drawer of the desk. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a small frame, dark wood, simple, the kind of frame that is meant to display something without competing with it. She had ordered it 2 weeks ago. She unwrapped it now and fitted the severance clause inside. She turned it over. She set it on the front corner of the desk, facing her. It was not a wound. It had been a wound for a long time. She would not pretend otherwise. Would not perform the particular kind of resilience that requires you to flatten what has been difficult in order to seem stronger than you are. It had been a wound. Now it was a receipt. A record of a transaction that had not gone the way the parties conducting it had intended, because they had not adequately assessed the asset they were trading. It was, in a way, the founding document of her life. The thing that had started the sequence of events that had brought her to this room, this chair, this name on this contract. She could keep it and remember, without being kept by it. She looked around the study. The books Silas had collected over 60 years. The structural engineering texts that she had worked through one by one in that narrow upstairs room, beginning at 13 and never really stopping. The window with its view of the water. The lamp. The drafting pen she still kept in the top drawer, a habit she had never broken. She was 28 years old. She had been sold for $1.2 million to cover a debt on a house that no longer existed. Raised in a fortress of concrete by a man who had taught her the tools without the tenderness. And she had taken those tools and built something out of them that no one could take from her, because she had designed it from the inside out, load-bearing walls and all. She had learned, in the process, things she would not have learned any other way. She did not say this to diminish what had been done to her. She said it because it was true, and she had committed, a long time ago in a dark kitchen, with a flashlight in her hand, to operating in the domain of what was true. Starting over was not a collapse. It was a new build. She picked up the community center contract. She put it in her bag. She would deliver it in person tomorrow, and then there were 3 other projects in various stages of design and a partnership conversation. She had been considering for a year and 100 decisions still ahead about what to make and what to leave standing and what to tear down. For the first time in her life, she would make them as someone who knew exactly who she was. She turned off the lamp. She stood and walked to the window and stood for a moment looking at the sound silver and wide and present, the afternoon light. Still working its way across the water, the far shore clear in the clean spring air. She signed her name, sometimes, on the designs when the project was complete. Not on the blueprints on the building itself, in the small discreet way that architects do, a detail that most people never notice. It was not vanity. It was accountability. It was a way of saying, this is mine. I made this. I stand behind what I have built. She was ready to sign her name. It finally felt like hers. Friends, how did Maya's story sit with you today? When I first encountered this story, what stayed with me wasn't the courtroom moment, or the handcuffs, or even the reading of the will, though all of those had their weight. What stayed with me was that girl on the stairs. 13 years old, wrapped in a wool blanket, holding a flashlight in a dark house, and choosing not to cry. Not because she wasn't hurt, she was. Deeply, and in ways she would carry for a long time. But because she had already begun, in that moment, the quiet work of figuring out how to survive. We talk a lot about resilience. It's one of those words that gets used so often it starts to lose its edges. But what Maya showed us today is what resilience actually looks like when it isn't pretty, when it isn't a triumphant speech or a dramatic turnaround. But a girl learning to read a room, and then a woman learning to read a building, and then both of those skills turning out to be the same thing all along. The people who were supposed to love her put a price on her and moved on. And she became, in their absence, someone who understood the value of things far better than they ever did. I think most of us have known, at some point in our lives, what it is to be underestimated by someone who should have known better. A parent, a partner, a colleague, someone who looked at us and saw something lesser than what we were. And I think most of us know, too, that the deepest injury isn't what they did. It's the moment we almost believed them. Maya never quite believed them. Not all the way. And that small, stubborn refusal, that refusal to let their accounting of her become her accounting of herself, was the load-bearing wall of everything she built. She hung the severance clause in a frame. Not to celebrate what was done to her, but to remember who she was before they did it, and who she became because of it. And to understand that those two things were both part of the same story and neither one canceled the other out. It's never too late to decide what your name means. It's never too late to sign it and mean it. Thank you for spending this time with me and with Maya today. If her story touched something in you, if you found yourself thinking about a moment when you chose to keep going rather than stay where it was comfortable, I hope you'll leave that in the comments. I read every one, and there is nothing I love more than knowing this community is listening together. And if this story gave you something, a little courage, a little warmth, a little reminder that the structure you've built is stronger than you sometimes think, please subscribe and hit that like button. Good things have a way of finding the people who put good things into the world. Thank you. I'll see you next time.